Welcome to our first Ask Us Anything about the history of Gloria Dei Old Swedes Church. During this informal Q&A, we're going to answer your questions about this National Historic Site and the surrounding neighborhood. I'm Candace Roberts, Chair of the Board for Historic Gloria Dei, and we're delighted that you have joined us for this live panel discussion. I'm going to first give a brief introduction to our panelists, and I have some questions for them in the event that you all need some time to get started with your questions, but I hope that you will enter your queries into the chat window so that we can bring light to some of the things you're interested in for sure. So first up, I would like to introduce Reverend Dr. Kim Eric Williams. You want to wave, Kim Eric? Wave, yes, thank you. Okay. Kim Eric is a curator, an archivist, and historian. He graduated from the Muhlenberg College with an AB, and he studied at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and received his MDiv in 1969. Kim Eric did graduate work in church history at Uppsala University in Sweden, and served the Church of Sweden in a large parish outside Stockholm. He's also a missionary to the Lutheran Church based in Port of Spain, Trinidad. Kim Eric has served as one of the editors and the principal translator for the 9-volume series, Colonial Records of Swedish Churches in Pennsylvania, published by the Swedish Colonial Society, and was a Swedish instructor at the University of Pennsylvania for 15 years. So thank you, Kim Eric. We'll be having some questions for you shortly. Next up, I'd like to introduce Jeanette Ware. Jeanette, wave, yay, thank you. Jeanette has been a member of Gloria Dei Church since her birth, and we won't say when that was. But I can tell you, Jeanette is the go-to person for Gloria Dei Church history. She served the church for many years as a historian and tour guide, and much acclaim from tourists and our visitors for the quality of her tours. And we've been so grateful for that effort. And Jeanette has also been working quite diligently to preserve our records, the church records dating back to 1700, probably earlier. Jeanette, you can correct me on that. And Jeanette has also been a founder and instrumental developer of our Lucia program. If any of you have had the chance to come to that in December, even this year under quarantine, we did a modified online one to keep the momentum going. But every year, Jeanette works with over 40 young girls and boys, teaching them to sing in Swedish and tell the story of St. Lucia. And that has become over the years the largest single fundraiser for Gloria Dei Church every single year. Okay, next up, I'd like to introduce Michael Schreiber. Michael, give us a wave. Thank you. Michael is an author and historian and a journalist. After graduating from Antioch College in 1968, Michael moved to San Francisco, where he participated in the local theater scene as an actor, director, and playwright, and as an independent filmmaker, which explains why Michael is an extraordinary lecturer for our series online. So thank you for that. After retiring from his 29-year job as a streetcar operator in San Francisco, Michael moved to Philadelphia's Queen Village and has been here since 2009. And he set about to investigate the history of the houses in the district in his street. And during his research, he encountered a much earlier neighbor, a Thomas Cave, who lived there for over two centuries prior. 6 years of writing and searching through numerous archives, Michael finally published a 737-page book, The Unsinkable Patriot, The Life and Times of Thomas Cave in Revolutionary America. And currently, Michael is working on 2 books. One is a novel that takes place in Spain during the Civil War of the 1930s and later in the early 1950s. And in other programs, he's working with Amy Grant, who I'll talk about next, to write a digest of the many lives of the people who are buried in the churchyard at Gloria Dei. And this brings us to Amy Grant. Amy, hello. Okay, so I asked Amy to send a brief bio. It was really sad, so here it is. But I embellished because I wasn't going to let her get away with that. Amy is a web developer and a graphic designer and an advocate for historic preservation. Her love of local history has resulted in an extensive body of work of essays, white papers, and our very own Founders magazine. Amy undertook a full inventory of the Gloria Dei churchyard, mapping and geotagging every permanent resident that we could identify. And Amy's going to tell us more about this project in a few minutes. And if you have viewed our website, you will see not only many articles from Amy and Michael, but also Amy's keen eye for design. I feel our Preserve Old Swedes website is truly beautiful and a wonderful resource for history buffs and genealogists. Since 2017, this is Amy's part now. She served on the board. She served on the board of Historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation, and she joined the board of Old Pine Conservancy at Ron Schaffer's request in late 2018. And prior to this, she served as the chair of QVNA's Historic Preservation Committee. Amy is also the creator and host of the podcast Great Talks at Gloria Dei, which again, you can access these, excuse me, at our website, preserveoldswedes.org, and wherever you listen to podcasts. And so now let's get started. Okay, so far, none of you have sent in any questions, so get to it. So I'm going to start with Michael. Michael presented for us in January on the perils of the sea, and the questions were great, and we didn't have enough time to get to all of them. So I'm going to ask Michael a few of those questions. Hopefully some of our folks from January are on this webinar tonight. So Michael, typically, what was the ethnicity of sailors at the turn of the 17th and 18th century around Philadelphia?
Well, I can only imagine that they would have reflected the ethnicity of the people who lived in this area. And those were principally people from the British Empire, from England and Wales and Scotland, of course, and Ireland. Those, I think, in the far majority, were the people who went to sea. For some reason, other ethnicities that were resident, let's say, in this neighborhood in the 18th century, like Germans, did not seem to go to. You don't see their names as often on the crew lists. So that's how
they have a very short coastline in Germany.
Perhaps that's the reason for it. It could be, yes.
Okay. You also told us last month about a woman who dressed up as a male sailor and joined a crew. So one of the questions were, how often were women joining crews? And if found out, were they typically met with acceptance or rejection? And were there any legal issues?
Women did not join crews very often. Usually the pattern of women at sea would be women who were wives of officers. For example, a sea captain, and the wife might be on board. And there are some stories of incidents in which the captain, then the man, the husband, caught sick or died. But the women were so well versed in how to run a ship, how to navigate and so forth, that they would take the place of their husbands as at least temporary captains. And there are some other stories that you hear from time to time of women who masqueraded as men, as regular crew members. It wasn't often, but for that reason, often the stories that you see are celebrated.
Okay, very good. All right, so Kim Eric, let's have one for you. So as a leading American expert in deciphering and translating 17th and 18th century Swedish script, you have worked on a number of projects that involve cataloging and interpreting history. And your most recent project is the colonial records of the Swedish churches in Pennsylvania. That book series is nearing completion, and I think it'll be a total of 9 volumes when you're done. Can you tell us about the origins of this project and why it is perhaps a missing link for researchers and lovers of Swedish colonial history?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. This began when I was not living in Pennsylvania. It began in 1995 when the historian of the Swedish Colonial Society decided that this was the missing link. The Swedish congregation in Wilmington, which is slightly older than Gloria Dei, had its records translated in 1880. Very poorly translated by someone who didn't know Swedish, but that's another matter. They felt that they were translated. And then there were Swedish churches in New Jersey, 2 of them. And the Works Project Administration came up with the money, and Amandus Johnson, who founded the Swedish Museum, translated the records of Raccoon and Penn's Neck. So what was left was Gloria Dei. No one had ever translated Gloria Dei's records, and it was not just Gloria Dei Church, but it was also the subsidiary congregations, St. James and King Sessing, and Christ in Upper Marion, and even way up in Amity Township, St. Gabriel's Church in Douglasville. So none of this was available to scholars, although at Gloria Dei Church there was a large volume of original manuscripts written in parchment in very good condition that had been put together at the beginning of the 20th century, but no one had ever tried to read it. And nobody wanted to try because of the handwriting, because of the different handwritings. So that had been kind of a puzzle and had been sitting there all those years. And the Swedish Colonial Society decided that this was indeed a worthy project. So they went to David Rivers, who blessed memory and ministry at Gloria Dei. He and Peter Craig got together and wrote to a number of foundations and individuals who might be interested in doing this and raised enough funds to accomplish it. And we began in 06, was the first volume that came out. And we are up to 6B, and we have 7A and B, which we hope will be printed next month. And this takes us from the very beginning of the log churches down at Tinicum in 1646, all the way up to the time when Nils Collin is instituted as rector at Gloria Dei in 1786, because after that, all of the records are in English. So there wasn't any necessity for us to go beyond that. But all of these other things, which are a great deal of items. I mean, there are parish records, vestry records. There are letters of the pastors writing back to Sweden, saying what they think of people in the church and what's going on. There are letters from the bishop or the archbishop giving advice, telling them what not to do, what to be careful of, and how they are to behave. So it's a real treasure chest of things, and there are even things in it that had never been found before. Even though this is colonial records of Swedish churches in Pennsylvania, we have the records for the beginning of Trinity, Old Swedes Church in Swedesboro, New Jersey. We have all the dirt on that church. And there is quite a bit of dirt. Very interesting.
Okay.
And maybe that's why that wasn't translated by Amandus Johnson, or maybe he didn't have it. But we have that information too. And that's a fascinating story that just reminds us that, as the Greek said, the more it changes, the more it's the same. Okay. And people have always been the same.
Wonderful. Well, you mentioned Dave Rivers, who was one of the longest serving rectors at Gloria Dei. So I'm going to ask Jeanette, Gloria Dei is well over 300 years old and has only had 22 rectors in all that time. So, Jeanette, will you tell us a bit about these rectors? And if you have any thoughts on why there's so few, is it we just the most best place to be? What is it?
That's nice people.
Actually, yeah, a lot of our clergy have had many years here. Reverend Symes served his whole entire ministry at Gloria Dei, and he served for 47 years. Nils Colleen, which Kim Eric had referred to, he was here for 45 years. Dr. Rope, which was the minister when I was born, he was here for 37 years. And Yehu Clay and Dave Rivers were both here for 32 years. So there's a lot of, long tenures. Locke was there for 29 years before the church was our church building was built. And then there was 5 that have been there for 11 or more years. Andrew Sandell was there for 17 years. Jacob Fabricius was 14 years. Johan Lidman was 11 years. Anders Goranson was 11 years, and Joy Sigel was 11 years. So we have long tenures.
In your history that you all are monitoring and reading all the time, did you ever get any sense of why so many of them made these long careers at Gloria Dei? I mean, I know the Episcopals and the Lutherans, it seems to a certain extent, let their rectors stay a long time, as opposed to the Methodists. Like if you go visit Old St. George's, they have 2 massive tablets that are like, I don't know, 10 feet long, with people turning over every couple of years, because that's what they do. They rotate their clergy. But why? Do you have any readings or any insights on why so many were willing to spend their entire career here?
No, they just seemed, very content with the congregation and the surrounding. Even the early days with the Swedish missionaries, they would, be here for a couple years, and then Sweden would call them back home, or if they, didn't like the country, then they would ask to be sent back home. But a lot of them, stayed. You figure Andrew Rudman, which was the first rector in Gloria Dei, when he was replaced by Sandell, Rudman covered the pulpit of Christ Church when their minister went back to England. So they just, liked the Philadelphia area and, just stayed.
Yeah, there's a theological reason too. For Lutherans and Episcopalians, a priest and the relationship to the congregation is considered to be a lifelong agreement unless something breaks it up. And the reason for that is that if there should be some great doctrinal problem or controversy, the priest cannot be forced out so easily, because he's not under a term call. But it leaves it open that whoever happens to be the priest or the pastor can leave whenever they want, or they can stay until the times of retirement. Except in the old days, there was no retirement.
No forced age for retirement, right?
There was no pension. Mm-hmm. So the pastors had to keep working till they fell over. And Nils Colleen, at the end had 2 young assistants, because at being over 80 years of old, he wasn't anxious to get on a horse and ride to Upper Marion for a Sunday service and come back the same day. So it was very difficult in those days to leave the job, because you had no support unless you married a spouse who was rich. So that would be your way out if you really wanted to leave.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully they loved it too.
I think so.
Okay. So Amy, I mentioned in our opening remarks that you have done such wonderful work with mapping the churchyard. Do you want to give us your take on this project and how you feel it, how it progressed, and if you would have done anything differently. Although I can't
Sure.
imagine, because it seems perfect to me. So
Oh, it's far from perfect.
what are your
So it became pretty clear to me when I joined the board of Historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation that thinking about the Gloria Dei campus, the property, and recognizing that the church grounds are surrounded by land owned by the National Park Service, and because of that, the grounds are always open, and people stop by all times of the day, all the time, and they're always looking for the spot where their ancestor was buried. And since we didn't have anything published or a comprehensive map, I started to think about how we could make information available to people who are visiting, who show up unannounced, which is great. But you know, Jeanette would get called all the time. Oh, so and so's here. Can you come over and give them a tour? You know, and you can't just drop everything and go over there all the time. So that was why I started working on that project. And Michael and I went and looked at how other local churches were representing their churchyards, what kinds of interpretive signage they were putting up, how if they publish maps, what those maps look like. And in most cases, the maps that are published are really designed to go with tours, because they just point out the graves of specific people that are usually part of a tour, you know, that person's story might be told in a tour. And I felt for us, it might be more useful to have a map that identifies the graves of every single person that we know. And so our map is designed a little bit differently. If you've ever seen it, it's got about 900 little circles with with numbers, and those numbers correspond to a list of names on the back. But when I did that map, I only included the places where a gravestone remains. So whether it's a footstone or a headstone or even a partial piece of stone. I didn't include the places where I know a plot where I know somebody's for sure that somebody's buried, because I thought, how's somebody going to find this spot, right? I think that was a mistake because I've come to learn pretty quickly that people want to know the exact spot. If you know what it is and you could show it to them, they get really excited regardless of whether or not there's a gravestone there. So I'm now going back and revising the work that I did to include the 100+ that I didn't put in the first time.
Well,
So you'll see the online map getting updated. The paper map, once we run out of copies, we'll reprint that, and that will also be updated with all those names and all those spaces, but it'll be color coded. So if a stone's not there, it might be blue instead of, you know, green or whatever, to make it clear. But hopefully that'll help people find what they're looking for when they visit us.
With the geotagging that you did, people who visit are able to get step-by-step walking instructions to the markers that they're looking for. So that strikes me as a really cool use of technology.
That's for the people who have smartphones or tablets. I mean, for a lot of, which is why we did that. But for a lot of people who visit us, they don't. You know, they need a piece of paper. So this is why we took the approach of publishing both formats.
The map is available. Yes.
Yeah.
So marvelous. Thanks. All right, Michael. You've written extensively on the life and times of lesser-known Philadelphians who resided in the modern-day Queen Village and from the 18th and 19th centuries, many of whom were collected to Gloria Dei. Now, what draws you to these subjects? Why do you find them fascinating?
I've always been interested in looking at history in general and personal stories. Just for me, it animates it. It makes it more real to our own times, to my life, and I think that others identify the same way, or I would like them to be able to see real people there, as Kimeric was saying, with some of the same interests and foibles and that we have in our own time. So for me, in my inquiries, I've tried to ferret out what these personal stories might be. So there's that, and then there's the joy in the discovery, in the detective work itself, in going through old papers you might find in a library or archive, or ancient newspaper articles, from 200 years ago and that sort of thing, and piecing it all out bit by bit, and then, aha, there's the answer, or at least we think it is, as far as the evidence that we have. So that's what interests me, among other things. And just finally, because I love Philadelphia, and I love the architecture and the setting that we live in, and I personally wanted to know more about it and try to translate that, through things that I write for other people.
Well, anyone can certainly enjoy reading Michael's articles at preserveoldswedes.org. And Michael, what is your website where they could order your book about Thomas, about Cave?
Yes, thank you. It's Phila, like the abbreviation for Philadelphia, philahistory.org.
Okay, great. I highly recommend it. You mentioned learning the history elements and finding out these interesting bits. And so Kim Eric, I wanted to ask you, as many of you know on the call, and certainly everyone on the panel today, Gloria Dei has been undergoing its first Keystone Grant project to repair and paint the church. And I would recommend to all of our visitors on the call tonight, when you're able to get over to visit the church, because it is looking so pretty. The interior is painted and clean and fresh, and the walls have been repaired. And while we were doing that work, it brought to light that there are these two marble tablets that speak about a John Hanson, a Colonel John Hanson and another John Hanson. And we know they were installed about 80 years ago. And they're supposed to be talking about the same John Hanson, and we found out they're mostly wrong. So Kim Eric, will you tell us what's surrounding the controversy of these two plaques that we now want to try and correct the story?
Well, this is an odd story, and it began at the end of the 19th century when someone was doing a study of the patriot John Hanson from Maryland, who was a lawyer, and he was a very famous person involved with the Articles of Confederation and representing the state of Maryland. They thought the name Hanson must be Swedish. Even though they had no evidence for this, they decided that this was the case. And when this was published, some of the Swedes who had just come to America in the 1880s and 1890s got very excited because they said, wow, John Hanson, he was the first president of the United States, and he was a Swede. And so, wow, we have background almost as good as the Mayflower. We go back before William Penn. Well, of course, the truth of the matter was John Hanson was English. He wasn't Swedish. He also was not president of the United States. He was chair, a one-year position under the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution was adopted. So he was not from Pennsylvania. He wasn't Swedish. He never went to church at Gloria Dei. And as far as we can see, he was a good patriot, born in Port Tobacco, Maryland, where his birthplace is a historic site, but having no connection either with the church or with the presidency. But it just kind of shows how sometimes we can make a good story worth something. It doesn't matter if it's true or false. It's such a good story. We really want to believe it because it makes us feel somehow a part of things when we're not feeling a part of them. So the John Hanson myth went so far as the Swedish Colonial Society in the early 1960s even put up a monument in the churchyard of Gloria Dei, where they had a sculptor put a bust of John Hanson there. And they dedicated with all sorts of special things. And there was a United States stamps were made about the first president of the United States. And as time went on, we began to understand that this was not quite accurate. So the hexagon was pulled down and was given to the John Hanson birthplace in Port Tobacco, Maryland, where it can be seen without him being Swedish. And he's actually buried right outside of DC in his home near Oxon Hill, Maryland. So we've discovered a lot more about John Hanson, but the interesting thing is that the plaques not only say that he was Swedish and that he was president of the United States, but that he was descended even from the first king of Sweden, Gustavus. Now that really was a stretch.
And that's not true at all. So.
No. And in fact, today a lot of historians feel that Gustavus, the first of the modern kings of Sweden, was also kind of a tyrant and wasn't always such a delightful historic figure as people thought 100 years ago. So it is really kind of humorous to see that kind of thing. It's like people in the United States, you know, that they put their ancestry back to the 1300s, and suddenly, you know, they're part of the royal household of someplace.
All right. And Michael, you were researching, you said you found numerous stories about this on the internet, in fact, using those plaques as citing it as proof. So what did you want to add anything to the conversation on the plaques?
Well, I was intrigued to see that. I think even the state of Maryland has something up there following. When you all trace it down, it goes back to this one book by a person named Hanson, as I remember, who styled himself as a descendant of this long lineage of Hansons going back to the Swedish king, which was nice for him, and found some Hansons that did live in New Sweden, in the Delaware Valley here in the 17th century, but had no relation to this Hanson in Maryland, John Hanson, that the so-called president of the United States was descended from. But it reminded me, if you don't mind my saying, that this sort of thing happens not infrequently in history research, I should say. And in our churchyard, you have a section supposedly devoted to revolutionary heroes. And those are monuments that were transplanted from the old Ronaldson's cemetery at 9th and Bainbridge, where the playground is now. And when the cemetery on Bainbridge Street was taken out in the 1950s and made into the playground, these monuments, for some reason, they saved and transplanted to the Gloria Dei churchyard, possibly because they found some figures on it with that had what seemed to be military, what do you call them? Like captain and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But in looking at them, Amy and I, for example, looked much closer at some of these figures that are memorialized there, and we found some of them are too young to have fought in the revolution. Some weren't born until after the revolution. Some were captains, not because they were military captains in the revolution, but they were sea captains. And all we could trace had somewhat interesting histories, but they just are not revolutionary soldiers or heroes. And yet, unfortunately, people go there to this day and plant American flags there quite reverently. So I think that's a section also that we'll have to identify more accurately and give each of these people memorialize their due, their true history.
So Michael, we should also explain to everybody that there is a plaque in that section naming all of these revolutionary soldiers and just explaining, you know, that they were saved from Ronaldson's. I forget which historical society endorsed that. It doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. But so that also leads to this, you know, perpetuates this myth, basically. So it's a similar story to the Hanson plaques.
All right, I have some nice questions coming in from our audience. So let's, the first one is from Jim Murphy. It is surprising that Philadelphia's port became so popular considering it was about 110 miles from the ocean and that travelers up the river had to land in sight on both sides of them on a, on both sides of them on a trip that took up to 2 weeks in sailing days. So any comments on why this became such a popular port? I guess maybe Kim, Eric, or Michael?
Well, there are lots of reasons. It was the one available. And that's the most important thing, because the Dutch had the best one in New York because the Hudson doesn't freeze. And that was a better port. And Baltimore was already established with Jamestown and the Virginia colony. So that left the Delaware as the only major pathway where you might be able to do something. And of course, that's why William Penn wanted the grant.
Okay. I have another question. I think this one maybe is.
I could say something on that.
Oh, sure. Go right ahead.
Philadelphia primarily became the major port in North America in the middle of the 18th century because it was a metropolis in itself, and it had a certain, it had a large population and a certain amount of wealthy people who desired luxuries from Europe, from England, and so forth. And for that reason, it was more lucrative for merchants to ship to and from Philadelphia. That's, I think, the primary reason why it grew to preeminence, you know, as a port.
It also had a very strong agricultural background for supplies to ship out, which a place like Boston didn't have.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that its primary export for large part of the 18th century was wheat and wheat flour.
Flour, yeah.
But unfortunately, there were tariffs in Britain, so it couldn't ship directly to Britain. So they had to try to ship it to other countries like Portugal, for example, and then they could get goods from Portugal in turn that would go up to Britain and then take the fine cloths and furniture and so on from Britain back to Philadelphia, a triangular trade.
So I have a follow-up question from Al Cavallari. I think the question wondered why not a port closer to the ocean? So why all the way up the Delaware? Any comment, any further comments on that?
Well, I think that has to do with why William Penn founded Philadelphia between the two rivers. And he, as I understand it, he was unable to purchase sufficient land, let's say down in Chester, which was his first choice. from the Swedish families that owned it. So I think that's the reason. It was fortuitous, I think, because it was a high ground. 2 rivers was perfect for commerce, especially later, and it worked out very well.
Okay.
Yes, that's the case, and of course the river has to be deep enough, and it's all the way up to Trenton you can go, so that allowed you also to trade further up the river. So there were a lot of advantages to Philadelphia and where it was, and that's right. It couldn't be at Chester or Newcastle because there were settlements there already, so he had to move up.
And then also in this same theme, if all colonial and mother country British ports of 1770 were ranked by activity, where do you think Philadelphia would be? Any ideas on that?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. If
you were comparing, like you mentioned, New York and Baltimore and Boston, and in terms of activity, I'm thinking where would Philadelphia be on that list?
Philadelphia was first on that list.
Absolutely.
By 1770, yeah, by 1750, yes.
Okay, interesting. Okay.
It was the biggest city in British North America.
All right, that question was from Daniel Campbell. Thank you, Daniel. I have another question now from Jill DeAndrea. This one might be for you, Michael. Do you have any information about the John Palmer House on 117 Lombard Street, which was built in 1743, and the house on the left side also built by him? Or Amy, you might. Do either of you know about the John Palmer House on Lombard?
Well, John Palmer was a bricklayer of the era, and he built a lot of the buildings in that vicinity, like some of them that at least used to stand along 2nd Street, where the Head House Market is now. I don't remember that much about him. I've researched him in his past, but it's I don't have all the information handy right now.
Okay. I have some questions from Mike Teddy. The middle one, I think we've dealt with. He says, was the first president, John Hanson, related to King Gustavus Adolphus? And so we've cleared that up. No, none of that is true. So again, we'll be putting interpretive signage next to those beautiful plaques, pointing out these mistakes and telling the proper story. The other questions from Mike are, is there documentation of when William Penn visited Gloria Dei? So Jeanette, do you know anything in the records, or Kim Eric between the blue books?
Yes.
Well, he signed Rudman's naturalization paper.
And what year was that? Do you remember or no?
1702.
All right, so we know at least that. Okay.
And
do we have any other documented visits that we know?
we can check to see if he was there at the dedication. When the church was built, there was a pew in the front reserved for the governor.
Okay.
Now, did he ever use it? That's the question. Being a Quaker, he probably wasn't too excited, but on the day it was dedicated, there was even a summary of the service and the sermon in English, even in 1700. Recognize that there would be many people from the town and from the government who would be present. Whether Penn himself was present, I'm not sure.
Okay.
My friend who's in the audience today, our friend Jim Murphy, has done a fair amount of research on William Penn, and he's confirmed that Penn was in Pennsylvania, at least during the time of the church dedication. And the historian George Boudreau puts in his book that it's believed that Penn attended the ceremony that Kim Eric was just describing.
He would have, because at the time it was such a big building.
Yeah, it seems extremely likely.
But it was considered huge.
Yeah, it seems extremely likely. I mean, it seems like everybody would have wanted to come to that event.
Yeah.
You know, to see this great edifice right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. And one more from Mike. What can you tell us about the Philadelphia Rambo family? I know they are one of the Swedish forefather members as defined by the Swedish Colonial Society, but do we know anything more or anything we comment on about the Rambos being here at the time of New Sweden?
Well, they were here for a long time. And of course, Peter Gunnarsson Rambo was also one of the interpreters for William Penn. A number of the Swedes were very multilingual. They could do Dutch and they could do Lenape. Some could do also German. And the Rambos had a position like that they helped Penn.
Jeanette, in your years at Gloria Dei, did you ever meet any Rambo family members? Do they come to Gloria Dei?
Oh, yes, and they'll ask you to do their ancestors, the research on it, which can take hours and hours and hours and hours, because there's a lot of Rambos in the church.
The family ancestry is composed of 5 large paper-bound books with thousands of names in it.
Okay.
So it is a huge family. The Rambos are all over.
Okay. I'm also going to give a plug for the Swedish Colonial Society website, which is colonialswedes.net.
Right.
They recently unlocked all of the information of their historic newsletters that were done by Dr. Peter Craig. So you can search these newsletters from the last, I don't know, what, 20 years, Kim Eric? And
Tiny.
okay, and see if there's information concerning your family members there. I have a comment from Marcia Cates. My 3rd great granddaughter, Louisa Nagley, I hope I'm not killing the spelling of that, 1816 to 1990, is buried in the churchyard. So Amy, does that ring a bell? Do you know where Louisa is?
Yes, I do. And I think part of her stone is still standing. I'd have to pull up the map and tell you exactly where she is. But if you go on our website and you type in Nagley, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly, you'll see there are at least 3 or 4, and they're all buried next to each other in the section that's sort of right outside Riverside Hall.
And another related permanent resident question, this is from Terry Brasco. Do we know who the people are who were buried under, she wrote 295, but I think maybe you mean I-95? Aren't some people left behind under I-95?
I'm not so sure about that. I know that there was a second burial ground where the if you know where Shot Tower is across Front Street, if you look at it now, there's like a baseball diamond. That's roughly where it was. And I don't know how long that was in use. Maybe not very long, maybe 10, 20 years, something like that. I think Jeanette and Dr. Williams would know better than me.
I know there was a graveyard out at 2nd Street too. It went out to 2nd Street at one time, but
I think that's the one. That's the same one.
I don't know of any bodies being left.
You think they were dug up at the time and moved someplace, consecrated someplace else? So.
Yeah, I don't think it was under I-95. I think that's my guess, but I don't know.
Okay.
You know, whenever I do, you guys are gonna figure out what a dork I am. Whenever I do research on a particular building in Queen Village, I don't stop with when I thought the building was built. I try to go back all the way to figure out which Swanson family member owned it, or whoever it was. And I think the space along Front Street where I-95 is, that was all owned by, doesn't appear to have been owned by the church. That was all owned by different people, like the Swansons, later the Duchesnes, and descendants of that family. So I don't think that the burial ground was that far. I don't think it was under I-95. So you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know. Michael?
Okay.
As far as remains being there, one never knows, but there are stories of remains being found in recent decades.
Oh, at Shot Tower, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, at the Shot Tower. I don't think it did extend all the way to 2nd Street, but there was an entrance up the alley, which is now Salter Street, into the graveyard.
Well, Terry just commented that she had found that in a book and doubted it, but the book asserted that there were graves under there. So that was the basis of her question. So.
Well, I saw online some, and I'm sorry, I don't remember where this was, but there was a claim about this as well. And the evidence that the person cited for the claim is if you, I guess it's the Carpenter Street walkway, that's what we call it, which cuts across the 100 block of Carpenter under I-95 and then takes you to Gloria Dei. It's a brick walkway. Right now there's a parking lot there, so people drive their cars over it. But there's a plaque, not a plaque, I guess it's a plaque that's over there, which is related to the Swedish settlement. And I noticed somebody took a picture of that and cited that as evidence. And I'm like, well, no, this is just decorative. I think this is probably decorative. I don't know what the story of that is, but I don't think it has anything to do with the graveyard.
Okay. This question might be for Jeanette and or Kim Merrick. This is from Mark Bankston. Do you have any comments on the contributions of Anders Bankston, aka Andrew Bankston, to Gloria Dei as a lay reader?
As a lay reader.
Yes, well, he was the one who was having the church services when there was no pastor after Fabricius died. You know, the Swedish settlers on the Delaware wrote a number of times to Europe when their pastors were getting old. They wrote to the Lutheran Consistency in Amsterdam because they could understand Dutch, and apparently that letter never reached its destination, or they didn't feel like spending the money. And it took quite a while until 1697 till the three pastors came to renew the work of the Church of Sweden on the Delaware. So after Fabricius died, it was about, I guess, 2 years or so where there was no pastor at all at Gloria Dei Church. And there was no pastor either at Holy Trinity in Christina. So in Christina, you had Charles Springer, who was the lay reader, and at Gloria Dei, you had Andrew Bankston. And what they would do would be literally read parts of the liturgy, read the assigned scripture lessons. If they could sing, they would lead the singing. They didn't need to have hymnals because everybody memorized all the hymns. They had them from memory. And they would probably read a sermon from a book, a postilla, that had to do with that particular day in the church year. The Swedes didn't know what else to do on Sunday except go to church, because they always did that. There was no movies, there was no card playing, there was nothing else to do, and that was a part of your life. You heard the same Bible lessons every Sunday. If you lived to 70 years, you heard them from 70 years. And you sang most of the same hymns every Sunday. You knew it was Advent, or you knew it was Septuagesima, or whatever it was. You knew what it was. And people felt that that was a part of their life they couldn't live without. So Andrews Bankston was very important as a link to keep the congregation going.
Right. Okay. I have a question from Al Cavallari. This might be for you, Jeanette. What is the exact relationship of the church with the National Park Service in terms of the Park Service's obligations, if any, to spend money on repairs or maintenance? What does the park do for the church? What are its obligations?
Zero. They do patrol the park grounds, but as far as any help to the church itself, we get nothing from the Park Service. They don't financially, help us. They just, keep their grounds, that's it.
Yeah. Now, if you have been to Gloria Dei recently, I don't know if you've been able to get there, Al. The Park Service did, right at the beginning of the pandemic, start replacing all the sidewalks that surround the property, and that had to be stopped for quite a while during the worst of the pandemic, but then they did start it up, and I think it's largely finished now, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So the sidewalks are quite lovely. And but that's about the limits of it. They do act a little bit as like park police for us when we need them to come have somebody encouraged to move someplace else. But in terms of maintenance money, there is no maintenance money. Yeah, but you know, overall, I think we have a good, strong relationship with them. So it's a positive. All right. So I have a question from Christine Pickup. And there seems to be the theme of angels at Gloria Dei. Gabriel's hanging from the ceiling, the angels in the stained glass, the angels on the grave marker at the front, and the angels on the wood carving on the choir loft. And that seems to be a lot of angels for such a small space. Is this typical for a Swedish church?
No. It just happens to be that we're still trying to understand where those beautiful angel carvings came from.
Yeah.
If they came from the old church in Tinicum, or if they were made by someone who could carve figureheads on the waterfront in Philadelphia, and it could have been part of an original altarpiece at Gloria Dei that disappeared during the Revolutionary War, and only that was left. We're not sure, but we know that it's old, and the writing on it is very interesting, because they're the verses for Christmas morning, glory to God in the highest, the angel song, and then the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. It's a prophecy from Isaiah for the Messiah. So these two phrases seem to have something to do with the name Gloria Dei, the glory of God. What is the glory of God? Well, it's not the building, it is that God became human. And so maybe Andreas Rudman put that up. We don't know. But then the window in the front of the church, which is new, 1846, I believe, is obviously copying those same angels because they thought they were so beautiful. And the angel who hangs from the top, Gabriel, is of course another Christmas sign. And that's typical of churches in Western Sweden, but not in other areas.
Nice. I have a question. Go ahead.
And we had the angels carbon dated at the art museum, and they found out it was yellow pine. So that's why we don't know if it's from Sweden or if it's from the United States, because yellow pine was common in both places.
Interesting. Okay. I have a question from Ellen in Verso. One of the things my family appreciates about Gloria Dei are the traditions and the traditional events. Are there any old traditions that we don't see anymore? And if so, why might that be?
Well, we used to have colonial fairs. We had connection with Alfred's Alley, and the first weekend in June, on Friday night, there would be a huge smorgasbord in the parish hall. And then on Saturday, there would be a fair out in what is now the National Park grounds. There would be a bus that ran from Gloria Dei up to Alfred's Alley, and those of us that were teenagers at the time would be dressed up in colonial outfits, and we'd ride the bus and go bring the people from Alfred's Alley down to church and take the people back again. That's one of the things. And then they used to do with the Swedish maypole too. That was another thing that is no longer done. That would have been celebrated in May.
That was for midsummer. The one thing that has disappeared completely is the early morning Christmas service. In Sweden, they never had midnight mass. They had 5 o'clock matins that you came to. You went to church for a little devotional service of carols on Christmas Eve. Then you went home and you ate and drank lots of aquavit and told stories and danced around the Christmas tree and had fun. And at 4:30, you were still awake. So you got up and you got the sled ready and you went out to church for your early morning service. And the Church of Sweden still has those early morning services, but they have gone by the wayside for those of us who don't like to get up so early.
Well, we don't have this minister coming down from New York anymore either to do the Ulata on Christmas Day.
Yeah, it's too much to do both of those services, you know.
I had a quick follow-up from Al on the Park Service. So they own the land, ? So Amy, as the mapper of the churchyard, would you just give us a because we're at our time limit, what's a quick overview of what's the Park Service part and what's Gloria Dei part?
So if you look at the church, if you look at the property from above, there is a green space to the left that runs from Columbus Boulevard, Delaware Avenue, to Water Street. And then if you look on the right side of the map, it's the same story. It's a green space that runs the same basic length. And the church owns essentially what's in between that. That's the easiest way to describe it. I mean, it doesn't line up perfectly, but that's the gist.
What's interesting too is there was houses along Christian Street, and Dr. Rope at one vestry meeting informed the vestrymen that they were all going to buy one of the houses and then donate it to the national park for the national parks. So the vestry had to buy a house if you were on the vestry.
And then give it away.
Give it away, yeah.
Good luck trying that these days.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are at our time limit. I do have one quick comment from Marcia Cates. She is also descended from the Stilley and Toy families. Well, Marcia, I can tell you, you're going to be very happy because our newest issue of Founders Magazine, which is designed and created by Amy Grant, has an article excerpted from Peter Craig about Olaf Stilley. And I can tell you it's fascinating. And Amy's done an amazing job. We should be getting delivery of our copies. So please be sure and contact us. Make sure we have your mailing address. I think we might, but let's be sure so I can get you a copy of that magazine. And I hope you have all enjoyed this. I think many thanks to our panel. You've all been great. And I love the dialogue, and I appreciate all the questions coming in from the audience. Great questions. Anybody want to say other quick wrap up before we shut this down?
No, thank you all for joining us this evening. This was a lot of fun.
Great. If you're so
asking questions.
Yes, questions are great. And if you are so inclined, please consider a donation to Historic Gloria Dei as we are finishing up the Keystone Grant project. Next up is the roof, which is in 5 years and $250,000. So that we'll be looking, putting our efforts into fundraising money for that. So thank you all.